Welcome to Creepy Whispers. I'm Jack Thompson, and here we'll explore stories that will send chills down your spine. Get ready to dive into the unknown, where each whisper hides a secret. First story. I'm shaking just remembering what happened in that clearing in the Washington mountains. It's been a few months, but I can't get it out of my head. It was supposed to be just a camping trip with my friends Mary and Margaret, you know. We needed a break from college to breathe some fresh air. We found this place on a traveler's forum online, a hidden clearing in the middle of nowhere. It seemed perfect. 3 friends in their 20s, ready for an adventure in nature. But we had no idea what a nightmare it would be. We arrived at the spot almost at nightfall. The sun was setting, and you could see orange rays between the trees. As soon as I stepped into the clearing, I felt something strange. A heavy silence, you know, as if the forest had swallowed all sounds. I tried to ignore that feeling. We set up the tents, made a campfire, and stayed there, talking and laughing. At some point, I felt a strong shiver. It was as if someone was watching us, but I shook my head to push the thought away. After all, who could be there in the middle of nowhere? When it got dark, we decided to take a walk around the clearing before going to sleep. That's when things started to get really weird. We grabbed our flashlights and started walking along the edge of the clearing. At first, everything was normal, you know. Mary was telling a funny story about her professor. Margaret wouldn't stop complaining about the mosquitoes. I was laughing, but at the same time, I couldn't shake that strange feeling. That's when Margaret's flashlight illuminated something on the tree beside us. Man, I swear my heart stopped for a second. It was a symbol like a bizarre drawing carved into the bark. It wasn't anything I'd seen before. It looked ancient and, I don't know, evil. Mary thought it was a prank by some other camper, but I wasn't so sure. We kept walking, and my God, there were more. Several trees around the clearing had these strange symbols. Some looked recent, others were already faded by time. I started to feel a chill in my stomach. Margaret suggested we go back to the camp, but I was like hypnotized by those drawings. I wanted to understand what they meant, you know. That's when I heard it. A whisper, very low, coming from the forest. At first, I thought it was the wind, but there wasn't a breeze. The leaves on the trees weren't even moving. The whisper was getting louder, clearer. I couldn't understand what it was saying. It was like a strange language. I looked at Mary and Margaret and saw the fear in their eyes. They were hearing it too. Suddenly, I felt like the temperature had plummeted. My arms got goosebumps and I could see my own breath in the air. Guys, let's go back, Margaret said, her voice trembling. But when we turned to go back to the camp, I realized I had no idea where we were. The trees all looked the same. The symbols were everywhere. It was as if the forest had changed around us. Panic started to take over. Mary tried to use her phone's GPS, but there was no signal. The whispers continued. They seemed to come from all directions now. I started to feel a pressure in my chest, as if the air had become too heavy to breathe. Margaret suddenly screamed, pointing to something behind me. When I turned, I swear I saw a shadow moving between the trees. It wasn't an animal. It was too big, almost the size of a person. But it moved in a wrong way, as if it had no bones. At that moment, fear took over completely, and we started running. We ran without direction, stumbling on roots and branches. My heart was beating so hard, I thought it was going to explode. Mary fell and scraped her knee, but we didn't even stop to see if she was okay. We just wanted to get out of there. After what seemed like an eternity, we finally got back to the clearing. Our tents were there, the campfire almost out. We fell to the ground, panting and shaking. We stayed silent for a while, just listening to the sound of our breathing. The whispers had stopped, but I could still feel that strange presence. "What was that?" Margaret asked softly, as if afraid something would hear us. Nobody answered. What could we say? It didn't make any sense. I looked at my watch and realized it was almost a.m. We had been lost in the forest for hours, but it seemed like it had only been a few minutes. I decided to check my phone again, hoping for a signal. That's when I noticed something strange. The battery, which was almost dead before we left for the walk, was now fully charged. I showed the girls and they checked theirs. The same thing had happened. We sat there in silence, trying to process what had happened. No one wanted to talk about what they saw or heard, as if putting it into words could make it all more real. Mary suggested we leave immediately, but I reminded her that the trail back was too dangerous to do in the dark. We decided to wait for dawn, but no one could sleep. We were all cramped in one tent with the flashlights on. Every sound from the forest made us jump. At some point, I heard Margaret crying softly. When the first rays of sun finally appeared, it was as if a weight had been lifted from our shoulders. The clearing looked normal again, almost welcoming in the morning light. But we didn't let our guard down. We packed our things in record time, barely stopping to eat or drink water. Before leaving, I took one last look around. The symbols on the trees were still there, but somehow they seemed less threatening. That's when I noticed something that had gone unnoticed the night before. There were marks on the ground, as if something heavy had been dragged around our camp. I didn't say anything about the marks to the girls. They were scared enough already, and I just wanted to get out of there as fast as possible. The walk back was tense. With every sound from the forest, we got startled. It felt like something's eyes were following us all the time. I tried to convince myself it was just paranoia, the result of a sleepless night and fear. But I couldn't get the image of that shadow moving between the trees out of my head. After about 3 hours of walking, we finally got to the car. It was only when we got in and locked the doors that I felt I could breathe again. Mary started the engine right away, wanting to get as far away from that place as possible. On the way back to the city, we were silent, each lost in our own thoughts, trying to make sense of what had happened. It was only when we stopped at a gas station that Margaret spoke. "Guys, look at this." She showed her arm, where there was a red mark. It looked like one of the symbols we had seen on the trees, as if it had been burned into her skin. We were shocked looking at Margaret's arm. She swore it wasn't there before, and I believed her. After all, how could she have done that to herself? The mark was too precise, just like the symbols on the trees. Mary suggested going to the hospital, but Margaret didn't want to. She said she just wanted to go home and forget about it all. On the way, we tried to rationalize what happened. Maybe it was some group doing a ritual in the forest, or maybe we had eaten something strange and hallucinated. But deep down, we knew that none of this explained everything we experienced. In the days that followed, I tried to return to normal routine, but I couldn't stop thinking about that night. I researched the region, ancient symbols, anything that could explain what happened. I found nothing conclusive. I tried to talk to the girls about it, but they seemed to want to pretend nothing had happened. Mary even blocked my number after I insisted too much on the subject. Margaret. Well, she disappeared. Her family said she decided to take a trip alone to find herself, but I can't help but think if it has something to do with that mark on her arm. 6 months have passed since that night, and I still can't explain what happened. I tried to go back to the clearing once, alone. I got to the beginning of the trail, but when I got out of the car, I felt such a great fear that I ran back. It was as if something was warning me to stay away. I never tried to go back. Mary eventually started talking to me again, but she avoids the subject. As for Margaret, she came back from her trip after a month, but she's different. Quieter, distant. The mark on her arm disappeared, but sometimes I catch her looking at the place where it was with a strange expression. Life went on, but that night left its marks. They're not big things, you know. Just small details that make me question reality sometimes. Like when I wake up exactly at 3:33 a.m. every night, without fail. Or when I see symbols similar to those in the clearing in random places, a graffiti on a wall, a drawing in a magazine. It's probably just a coincidence, my brain looking for patterns where they don't exist. But there are days when I feel like that forest has somehow followed me, as if it's calling me back. And honestly, I don't know if I'll ever have the courage to answer that call. Second history, it was just a weekend camping trip, but it turned into the scariest and most inexplicable experience of my life. My wife Sarah and I decided to spend a few days camping with our friends, John and Emily, on the shores of an isolated lake in Minnesota. We needed to escape the city hustle, you know. We wanted to breathe fresh air, hike, fish a bit. It seemed like the perfect plan to relax. As the day went on and night approached, we began to notice something strange in the air. I can't explain it exactly. It was more of a feeling, you know, like we were being watched. At first, I tried to ignore it, thought it was just travel fatigue or maybe the change of environment. We lit a fire, started roasting marshmallows, telling stories. Everything was fine until about p.m., I think, when I noticed something weird in the lake. John and Emily also noticed the strange lights in the lake. The four of us stood there, staring in silence for a while, trying to understand what was happening. The lights seemed to move slowly, as if they were some kind of underwater creature. But it didn't make sense. I'd never heard of fish or any other animal that glowed like that in fresh water. Sarah suggested we get closer to the shore for a better look, but I felt a tightness in my chest just thinking about it. The situation was getting increasingly tense. We decided to stay together and keep close to the fire, thinking that the light and heat might protect us somehow. John grabbed a large branch to use as a weapon, just in case. I kept an eye on the lake while Sarah and Emily watched the forest. The lights in the water seemed to be moving in circles, as if they were surrounding us. The silence was deafening. Not even crickets or owls made a sound. Around 3 in the morning, something changed. The lights in the lake began to intensify, getting brighter and moving faster. It was as if they were dancing underwater. At the same time, we heard noises coming from the forest, like breaking branches. My heart raced. Sarah squeezed my hand so hard it hurt. John stood up, firmly holding the branch he had picked up as a weapon. Emily started crying softly. The tension was palpable. Time seemed to have stopped as we observed the scene before us. The mist continued to spread across the lake, but didn't reach where we were. We stayed there, tense and quiet, for what seemed like an eternity. Nobody said anything. You could only hear our heavy breathing and Emily's occasional muffled sob. Suddenly, we heard a strange noise coming from the lake, a kind of low, constant hum. We couldn't identify the source of the sound, which only increased our anxiety. I don't know how long we stayed in that situation, paralyzed by fear and uncertainty. Gradually, I noticed that the sky was starting to lighten slightly. Dawn was coming, and with it, a glimmer of hope. The lights in the lake seemed to be getting weaker, as if the arrival of day made them lose strength. The mist also began to dissipate slowly. I looked at the others and saw the same cautious relief on their faces. No one dared to speak yet, as if we were afraid of breaking some kind of spell. As we moved back to the campsite, I saw that everything was exactly as we had left it. There were no signs of invasion or anything out of place. For a moment, I wondered if we had imagined it all. But one look at the tired and frightened faces of my friends was enough to know it was real. Sarah started gathering our things, saying we needed to leave as soon as possible. Nobody disagreed. The trip back home was silent. Each of us was lost in our own thoughts, trying to make sense of what we had experienced. When we got to the city, it was like we had returned from another world. The busy streets, people coming and going, everything seemed so normal, so distant from that night by the lake. We said goodbye to John and Emily in the parking lot, promising to meet soon to talk more about what happened. A few weeks have passed since that weekend, and I still can't stop thinking about what happened. Sarah and I rarely talk about it, as if we had made a silent agreement to leave that experience in the past. But sometimes when I'm alone, I find myself looking at water, whether in a pool or a lake, expecting to see those mysterious lights again. I know I'll never fully understand what happened that night, and in a way, that scares me more than anything I saw. Third story, I'm still trying to process what happened to me and my friends on Mount Schreckschorn in the Swiss Alps a few months ago. It's one of those experiences you can't get out of your head, you know. We were super excited about this climb. Schreckschorn is a pretty obscure peak, one of those you can't find much information about online. Me, Ethan, and Olivia are experienced climbers. We've done several expeditions together, but nothing could have prepared us for what we'd face up there. That morning, we woke up early at base camp and started the ascent. The weather seemed perfect, blue sky, almost no wind. As we gained altitude, I began to notice strange things. First, there were some pieces of old equipment scattered along the way. No big deal, I thought, probably remnants of other expeditions. But then we found an abandoned tent, completely torn. It looked like it had been left in a hurry. I felt a chill in my stomach, but tried not to give it much importance. We kept climbing, focused on reaching the spot where we'd set up camp for the night. As we climbed higher, the air became thinner and the landscape more desolate. It was almost 2 in the afternoon when we reached a plateau where we decided to set up camp. While we were arranging our things, I noticed Ethan was a bit restless, looking around as if he was hearing something. I asked if everything was okay, and he said he had the impression of hearing distant voices. I thought it was strange because I couldn't hear anything but the wind, but I shrugged it off. Sometimes altitude does that to you, right? We finished setting up the tents and decided to explore the area a bit before it got dark. That's when things started to get really weird. About 200 meters from our camp, we found a kind of circle formed by stones. It seemed to have been made by someone, but it made no sense to have such a structure there in the middle of nowhere. Olivia, who was always the most skeptical of the group, suggested it could be the work of other climbers. But man, those stones were huge. Some must have weighed more than 100 kilos. How could anyone have moved them at that altitude? We stood there for a while, looking at that stone circle, trying to understand what it could be. That's when I noticed something even stranger, the shadows. It was about p.m. The sun was already going down, but the shadows of the stones made no sense at all. They pointed in different directions, as if there were multiple light sources. I mentioned this to Ethan and Olivia, and they were as perplexed as I was. We even took photos, but when we looked at our phones, the images were all distorted, as if there was some interference. We decided to return to the camp because the sky suddenly started to cloud over. And when I say suddenly, I mean suddenly. 1 minute everything was clear. The next dark, dense clouds appeared. The wind started to pick up, and with it came a sound. Man, I still can't describe it properly. It was like a buzzing, but it also sounded like a distant chant. You could feel the vibration in your chest. Olivia said it must be the wind passing through some rock formation, but I had never heard anything like it in all my climbs. The temperature dropped about 10 degrees in a matter of minutes, and we ran to take shelter in the tents. Inside the tent, Ethan, Olivia, and I huddled together, trying to keep warm. The buzzing outside was getting louder and louder, almost deafening. Suddenly, an intense light pierced through the tent fabric, as if it were broad daylight outside. But it wasn't normal light, you know. It had a greenish tone, kind of pulsating. We looked at each other, not knowing what to do. Ethan suggested we take a look, but Olivia and I were paralyzed with fear. When we finally mustered the courage to peek outside, what we saw left us speechless. The sky was covered by an aurora borealis, but it made no sense to see this in the Alps, especially at that time of year. The colors were too intense, moving almost hypnotically. And in the middle of that light spectacle, I swear I saw shapes moving. They weren't birds or planes, they were. I don't know, man. They looked like humanoid figures floating in the air. I rubbed my eyes, thinking it was some effect of the altitude, but Ethan and Olivia were seeing it too. Olivia, who was always the most skeptical, was white as a sheet, muttering something about this being impossible. We stood there, paralyzed, staring at that impossible sky for what felt like an eternity. The figures kept moving, sometimes seeming to look directly at us. Fear gave way to a strange sensation, as if we were hypnotized. It was Ethan who broke the trance, shaking us and shouting that we needed to get out of there. But when we tried to move, I realized my feet were sinking into the ground. It wasn't melted snow or anything like that. The ground itself seemed to be turning into a kind of quicksand ... In panic, we struggled to free ourselves. We managed to reach our backpacks and started descending the mountain blindly, stumbling on rocks, slipping on snow. The aurora kept illuminating everything with that greenish light, making the shadows dance in a surreal way. At one point, I looked back and swear I saw our camp being swallowed by the ground, the tents disappearing as if they had never existed. The buzzing got so loud, I thought my eardrums would burst. I don't know how long we ran down the mountain, guided only by survival instinct and that supernatural light. I can't say how long we spent descending that mountain, like crazy people. It could have been hours or minutes. I completely lost track of time. At some point, I tripped on a rock and fell face first on the ground. When I raised my head, I realized everything had changed. The sky was normal again, starry and without any sign of that crazy aurora. The buzzing had stopped, and the silence was almost deafening. I looked at my watch and couldn't believe it. It was a.m. We had spent almost 8 hours in that whole madness. Ethan and Olivia were as disoriented as I was. We looked at each other, trying to process what had happened. Our clothes were torn, dirty with mud and blood from small cuts. But the scariest thing was when we looked up. Mount Schreckschorn looked different. The shape of the mountain wasn't the same as we knew it. It was as if part of it had disappeared or transformed. Olivia, always the most rational, tried to argue that we were confused, that it was fatigue and stress. But I knew, we all knew, that what we had experienced was too real to be explained by exhaustion or collective hallucination. We stood there for a while, trying to catch our breath and make some sense of what had happened. No one wanted to talk much, as if putting it into words could make it all even more real and scary. We decided to continue descending until we found some shelter or rescue post. On the way, we checked our phones. No photos or videos of what we had seen. It was as if everything had been erased. Even the images we had taken before of the stone circle had disappeared. The only proof of what we had experienced was our exhausted bodies and disturbed minds. We managed to reach a village at the foot of the mountain by morning. People looked at us as if we were aliens. And well, after everything that happened, I kind of felt like one. We gave some story about getting lost during the night without going into details. Who would believe us after all? Since then, I've been researching Mount Shrekshorn, trying to find similar reports, some explanation. But I haven't found anything conclusive. Ethan, Olivia, and I still talk, but we avoid touching on the subject. It's as if that night had opened a door to something we can't understand, and maybe it's better that way. I just know that I'll never look at mountains the same way again, and that there are things in this world that defy everything we believe we know about reality.